Alright, so welcome officially to the fourth quarter. Chapter 9.1 represents your first test of the quarter, first quiz of the quarter. This chapter itself exemplifies the transition from foundational algebra and higher level mathematics. So you're moving up from the foundation to some things where you have to actually start thinking. You actually have to take your work ethic that you should have been developing up to this point and actually start applying it, which means that you have to be ready to work hard. You have to also remember and start adjusting your understanding or your level of what your goal is. A lot of you have tend to start off something thinking that you have to be perfect at it. But if you keep in mind how things have been going, we usually start out trying to understand it, and then you make mistakes for about 2 or 3 days while you practice it and you have the concept. But as you practice and make mistakes, eventually you figure out how not to make mistakes and you move closer to perfection. So don't approach this stuff and think I don't get it so I can't do it. What you should do is make sure you approach it as I don't get it yet, but I'll just try to grasp what I can and keep working on what's going on. But anyway, this chapter revolves around what we call quadratic functions, and of course the essential question is, what is a quadratic equation or function? A quadratic equation is a equation where the degree is 2. Remember, degree is the highest power. The particular equation actually has many properties that are used in real world applications, which we'll see a couple of them here and there. Properties of the graph is first, and so this is one of the things you're going to need to know for your homework, for your test, etc. Remember from last chapter, the standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. 2 of the letters give us direct information for the graph, that is the a and the c. So the b is important in terms of the graph, but it's not something that gives us direct information. What a does is a controls the width and the direction, so it tells you what direction it goes, and it tells you how wide it is. If a is positive, then the graph is smiling, and you might want to do this. That means the graph looks like this. If a is negative, that means the graph is frowning, which means it's going to look something like that. If the absolute value of a increases, and notice I said absolute value increases, the graph becomes more narrow. What I mean by that is, if you're comparing narrow graphs versus wide graphs, and you see a negative 3 compared to a positive 2, initially you would think that negative 3 would be smaller than 2, which is true because it is smaller, but the absolute value of negative 3 is 3, the absolute value of 2 is 2, so this would actually be more narrow as a graph, because again, as you look at a, as the absolute value goes up, the graph becomes more narrow. Again, we'll see that. And then c, just like anything else, notice how, again, going back to this sheet, let me pull it up here. Ax plus c, it would be the same as having 4x plus 2, which of course, if you remember when we graphed that meant go up 2, just like 3x minus 1 meant go down 1. That was your y-intercept. This is also your y-intercept and all that. Now, are you going to remember that? I guess only if you really care enough to try to remember that, but it does help you out. So looking at this stuff here, I'm going to draw a quick cheap sketch. What this does, this tells me that it is frowning, and this tells me that the y-intercept is 6. And so as a cheap sketch, it means that I should go up to 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Put a dot. And then what happens is it's going to go down. Just this cheap graph is going to look something like this. I don't know exactly how it's going to look, but it should have that general shape. You're going to have some questions on your homework that are just multiple choice. Which one is the graph? And you have to be able to kind of figure out, and using your common sense, you should be able to get there. B, again, this is telling me that it is smiling because A is positive. This tells me that my y-intercept is negative 3, which tells me it's going to start here or kind of go down there and then turn back around and go this way. So that should be the general shape of that. Again, if you don't understand, it is up to you to make sure you bring it over to me. It is amazing how many people don't ask me any questions and then they don't make it, and there's nothing I can really do because it's too late, because you wait until the test day or the day before the test to start asking questions. You and me should be having a lot of conversations, unless you're already a math pro, if you're going to have the proper habits to make it through the next 2 years in math, 3 years hopefully for you, because you should take all 4. But if you don't start having a conversation with me or whoever your teacher is, you're not going to make it through a lot of these, because you have to have some sort of a relationship with whoever your teacher is. The vertex is the point where the graph turns. So in these two cases, the vertex would be here, the vertex would be here. It represents a maximum or a minimum value. What that means is, if you notice, if this was a hill, your vertex here is a maximum. If you notice that this would be kind of like a pit, this would be the minimum. So the vertex is either a maximum or a minimum value. Again, write that for your notes as we continue to zip through all this information that we have to kind of get used to. Consider the graph as you answer each question. So again, what you're going to see as a question is going to say, what's the vertex? Well, the vertex is at the lowest point, which means in this case the vertex is 1, -1. And is it a max or a min? Well, the fact that it's going down this way and this is the lowest point, that makes it a minimum. And that's what you'll do for your homework also, is you'll put MIN. I don't need you to spell out the whole word. B wants to know the vertex. Again, looking at that, the vertex is the highest point, and in this case the vertex is -2, 4. Is it a max or a min? Because it's at the top of the hill, this would be a max. Alright? Again, that's how you deal with that part. Also recall that slope is rise over run. It just so happens that the quote-unquote slope of the equation gives us the first adjacent points of the vertex. And I know you don't know what that means, but hopefully you do revisit these videos, because sometimes if you watch the video with a little bit of background knowledge, more information comes to you. Alright, so based off of what we just did, this -2 means I should go down 2. Remember, that's my y-intercept. But here's the thing, that a actually represents, whatever is attached to x squared actually represents your slope, kind of. It's not a real slope because it's not straight, but it represents your initial slope, which means that 1/2 means I would go up 1 over 2. Now we know it's shaped like a U, which means we would go up 1 and back 2 also, and it means that our graph would look something like this, because you know it's going to be more wide. Whereas over here, this graph, if you remember, this 4 is telling me the y-intercept, which means go up 4. And this is telling me to go down 3 over 1, if you remember that. This is also telling me to go down 3 left 1, and notice how narrow this is because the slope is faster. Again, 1/2 as a number, remember talking absolute value of A, or of the value. So absolute value of this is 1/2. The absolute value of this is 3, because 3 is bigger than 1/2. That's why this is more narrow than that one, again, because the slope is not as steep. Please do not assume, looking at those two graphs, that graphing all quadratics is this quote-unquote easy. It may not be difficult, but again, there's a lot more that goes into it. It's just that the questions you're going to see today and some of the things that you're going to be able to put together will work better if you have some common sense associations with the equation. So please just try to remember that stuff as we continue to go. Also notice that the graph with a equals 1/2 is more wide than the graph with a equals -3, and again, that's because the absolute value of -3, which is 3, is bigger than the absolute value of 1/2. So if you're talking width of the graph, it's not about the sign, it's not about whether it's up or down, it's which number overall is a bigger number, and 3 is a bigger number than 1/2, which is why 3 would be more narrow. And that brings us to the questions that you're going to see on your homework, which is going to simply give you this question and say, which equation represents the widest parabola? Remember, wide is the smallest number, and you might want to work on doing that, making that association. So looking at this, -6 is the same as 6. 2, of course, is the same as 2, and this number is a 1, which means the widest parabola should be y equals x squared, and that's what you're going to type in, is whatever represents the widest parabola. Narrowest parabola should be the largest number, which in this case is this, y equals -6x squared. Again, I understand you're going to say, but that's a -6, and -6 is smaller than all these other numbers. Remember, we want the absolute value if we're talking about the width. It can go upside down. Going upside down has nothing to do with how wide it is, so just keep that in mind as we continue to go through this stuff. Then you'll see some with fractions. The fraction ones are the ones where you have to do your work. But again, it wants to know which one represents the widest. Again, that is the smallest number. And so what you will want to do, and I know some of you won't do it because you just like to do things your way, is you'll want to convert these into decimals. So this is 0.5. And again, I don't care about the sign. 2 divided by 3 is 0.67. And 1/6 is 0.17. Again, if you're breaking that down and you need all those to be even, those are the 3 numbers you're looking for, which means the smallest is, or the widest parabola is going to be y equals -1/6 x squared. The narrowest parabola is going to be the biggest number, and looking at these numbers, again, not with the negative, but looking at these numbers, this is, so you would type in y equals -2/3 x squared. Alright, so again, you have time to practice, you have all this time to try to get this down, and if you don't use it, I cannot help you, because it means that you're not really working to understand the concept. You're worried more about, finishing the homework or doing something else. It's all about understanding the concept. And the last thing we want to talk about is what is the ground. Now, that's not a real question. We obviously know what the ground is, but this last type of problem means that the only way you can answer it is if you understand what hitting the ground means. And so we're going to see a question like this where you have to think a little bit. It says a bird drops an object from a height of 310 feet. The function y equals negative 16t squared plus 310 represents the height y after t seconds. About how long will it take for the object to hit the ground? Again, if something hits the ground, we have two things. We have the height, which is y. We have t, which is time. If something's hitting the ground, we're talking about height, which means we're talking about the height of y, or what the value of y is. And think about the height of someone. If someone stands at 6 feet tall, or something is 6 feet above the ground and you drop it, we know it hits the ground when y equals 0. And so that's pretty much what you have to understand. If it's going to hit the ground, you have to understand that the height, which in this case is y, must be 0. And so what you can do is use a little bit of common sense and tenacity, which tenacity is important, and you can just plug it in. So that would be squared, because it's negative 16 times, because that would be 4 plus that, plus 310, which gives me negative 28.56. And because I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm just going to write all the numbers here. Remember, you can copy and paste, turn this into 4.5. This is negative 14. Turn it into negative 4.4, which is 0.24, and then 4.3 seconds, which is 1416. Now let me explain what this means so you can try to think your way through these questions if you happen to see them anywhere. Negative 28.56 means that it has gone through the ground, because remember that's the height. It means it's 28 feet below the ground. Obviously that's not it. Negative 14 means it's 14 feet below the ground. Obviously that's not it. Now I understand that 0.24 has not hit the ground, and it would be the same answer as if I had negative 0.24, because yes, I'd say that that's under the ground, but let's look at the fact that it's 0.24, which means that this is pretty close to 0, whereas that is another 14, which means it can't be. It means it takes about 4.4 seconds. Notice it didn't say how long, it said about how long. Now we will learn a way to officially answer this later, but for what you need to know right now is, if it is a multiple choice question and it's asking how long it takes to hit the ground, you should be able to just kind of plug some numbers in until you find the number that works best and then pick that answer. Again, that's 28 feet below the ground. That's not hitting the ground, that's going through it. This has also gone through the ground. This is still above the ground by 14 feet, which means the best, again, best are inside of quotes, best answer is 0.24, because that's pretty close to where you want to be. Other than that, again, go to your Math XL. Remember that this is your fourth quarter work. So even if you messed up a whole lot in the third quarter, those mistakes have been forgiven. It's just a matter of whether or not you want to work your way out of that hole, and that starts by doing what you're supposed to do, and that starts with work ethic, determination, and tenacity. Work on those things so when you leave me at the end of the year, you have the skills necessary to survive any class. But other than that, go to Math XL and move on, please. Thank you.